All right, can you guys hear me now? Okay, perfect. All right, I must have pushed some wrong button somewhere along the line. Okay, well, we're at 9:17, so we're going to get started here. All right, so just a couple of updates. I just want to make sure I don't have anyone not able to get in. Play enter, I don't want the meeting. Okay, looks like we're good here. And just going to type a quick message. Okay, so a couple of things. I imagine most of you guys have done the first aid test and have done the heart quiz. I have extended the heart quiz a little bit longer for those of you who haven't, but I would like for you guys to complete that as soon as possible. So that was based on the last two heart handouts that you had as well. What else was I going to say? First aid quiz, last time opportunity to finish that is Friday. And those of you who haven't completed your first aid booklets, I'm not taking them after Thursday. Okay, so you have that opportunity to do that. So make sure you do. Any questions, you can type them in chat or just talk to me if you have any questions about what we've been doing so far. All right. So the plan for today, we're going to start our next booklet, which is on blood. So that's already been posted. So underneath the cardiovascular folder inside your classwork, there's a section called blood, blood vessels and blood. So the blood vessels PowerPoints are in there, the ones that we took a couple classes to go through. And now we have a blood one. So today we're going to talk about the different types of blood cells. And then on next Wednesday's lesson, okay, we won't have a lesson on Monday because that's a holiday. So next Wednesday's lesson, we'll finish off that slide. But I did make a worksheet for you, and that worksheet's going to be due next week. So we'll talk about that towards the end of class. I've already posted that as a task on Google Classroom. Okay, so any questions? All right, without seeing questions, we'll move on to our next PowerPoint here. So we're going to start, whoops, I guess I need to share that with you. We're going to start talking about blood. Okay, I have way too many windows open here, so let's see if I can find my blood one. Oh, goodness. Just have to shut a couple windows. Sorry, guys. I'm not sure why this. Oh, there we go. Okay. Can you guys see the PowerPoint? If you can just put a quick yes or no on the chat. Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right. Just going to slide the chat over here. Okay, so we're going to talk about blood. So those of you that are currently or just finishing the cardiovascular system for Bio 20, again, lots of review from what you've been doing in Bio 20. This means that you have a good opportunity to get 100 in this section, so that's good. So with the blood here, there we are. And just want to put my annotate. Okay. So the cardiovascular system, so blood. So I have a few more word parts that we need to know for blood, okay? A couple are new, and then one is old. So the first one here is erythro. And erythro means red. I guess I should have put cyte as my one on the top there. Erythro means red. So erythrocyte is red cell, and that's the fancy word we use to talk about red blood cells. Okay. Leuco means white. So we know cyte means cell, so leukocyte is a white blood cell. And then cyte, we already learned about cyte way back in our very first module that we did. But cyte, we all know, means cell. And I used this word thrombocyte before. Does anyone remember what thromb or thrombo means? That was from our last with blood vessels, if you can type that in. Thromb or thrombo. No one remembers? Okay, so thrombo means clot. Thank you, Jenny. Thrombo means clot. So thrombocyte is the name of the cell or cell part that's responsible for clotting our blood. So it kind of kicks off this whole blood clotting process. Okay. All right. So why do we have blood? A few reasons. One of the biggest reasons for blood is to transport nutrients and wastes, right? And we know that because we've been talking about the pulmonary circuit, where we have blood that's going between our heart and our lungs. And then we have the systemic circuit, where blood's going from our heart to the rest of our body, okay? And that blood is carrying nutrients. So that would be like our glucose, that would be amino acids.
Fed? Oh. Can everyone still hear me? Something went off with my mic. Okay, good. And then wastes, right? So our cells, as they do their processing, they give off waste. One waste is carbon dioxide. Another waste is something called urea, right? That's from breaking down proteins. So we have these different wastes. So that's one of the big important things about our blood. Our blood helps to protect us from pathogens. So we want to remember pathogens are disease-causing organisms. So our blood has fighter cells in it to help protect us, okay? The problem right now, what we're having with COVID-19, is our fighter cells aren't able to do that great of a job with some people because their immune system's not able to fight it off very well, and they need the support of a breathing apparatus in the hospital. Okay, we haven't never been exposed to this virus before, so we don't have any fighter cells ready to fight it. We have to build that up, and that's why people who get it start to feel really sick, because that's their fighter cells trying to do their job. But not everybody's body is able to completely defeat this virus. And then one of the other important things about our blood is to prevent blood loss. So we have a blood clotting mechanism that helps to clot our blood, so when we get a cut, we don't just continue to bleed. Okay? All right. So if we take a look at blood, so our big thing today is to kind of look at just the different components of blood. So if we divvied our blood into a couple of parts, right? So we have about 55% of our blood is this part here, and about 45% of our blood is this part here, okay? So 55% of our blood is referred to as plasma. So plasma is just basically the liquid that everything floats in, okay? And then the formed elements, those are the big bits that are floating around in that liquid. So plasma is mostly water. And then that water is mixed with different things, like we'll have dissolved gases, we'll have amino acids dissolved in there. So there's all sorts of stuff that's dissolved in that water. So it has kind of a straw color to it, okay? And then we have these big bits, and the big bits we refer to as formed elements, and that's 45% of our blood. Okay, so 55% of our blood is basically water and all the stuff dissolved in it, which is referred to as plasma. Okay, and then 45% of our blood is our red blood cells, which we're going to talk about the fancy name we've just learned, platelets, and white blood cells. So those are the bigger bits. So we have cells, cell, and then a platelet is kind of a broken up piece of a cell. All right. When we donate blood, if we donate whole blood, which means everything, that's this whole piece right here. Okay, the 55 plus 45, that whole piece. If we donate blood, I think it's something like 72 days we have to wait before we can redonate blood. But we could just donate plasma, and I believe we can donate plasma about every 72 hours or something like that. It's under a week. Okay, so we still keep all of these things in our blood, and they just take out that liquidy part. Okay, and once you're 17, you're able to donate blood. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide here. Okay, so blood is made up of. So the formed elements of our blood, the first one is erythrocytes. So yes, you need to know that word, erythrocyte, and that's our fancy word for red blood cells. Okay. We have leukocytes. Leukocytes is our fancy word for white blood cells. Now there's 5 different kinds of leukocytes. We're not going to memorize those 5 different kinds. So you may have had to if you took about 20. We're not going to do that. There's other immunity courses in meds that you can do that in. And then platelets. Okay. Plasma, that's the liquid part. Okay, so the number 1 ingredient of plasma is water, and then everything else kind of floats around in it if it's a formed element, or is dissolved in it. Okay, so we have proteins in there, and nutrients in there, and dissolved gases in there, and all sorts of stuff like that. All right. Okay, so what we can do is we can centrifuge the blood. And so what a really common image is that we see when we talk about the blood is this kind of test tube looking thing. And I liked this image because then we got a sense for what I mean when I say the word centrifuge. So way back a million years ago when I used to work in the lab, I would use a centrifuge all the time. And basically what this does is it sorts stuff out by density. So when you give a blood sample, this is whole blood. So that's what they're looking at here. So this part here is whole blood. That's everything all mixed together, straight coming out of your blood vessel. What they're doing here is they're centrifuging it. So it means that it gets spun around really, really fast. Okay, so there's different types of centrifuges, but basically we're taking our test tube and we're spinning everything super, super fast, and everything that's heavy sinks to the bottom and the lighter stuff floats on top. Okay, so that's what happens with the centrifuge. So when we do that, the heaviest elements are the erythrocytes. So the erythrocytes are going to be that bottom part. So about 44 to 45% of our blood is red blood cells. Okay, so that's heavy, that's sitting here on the bottom. And then we have this middle region after we do the centrifuge. And that middle region has a fancy name. It's called a Buffy coat. You'll never have to memorize that from me. But it's made up of our leukocytes and our platelets. That's like 1 or less percentage of our whole blood. Okay, so very little of that. And then we have our plasma. So remember, that's that liquidy part, or the water with the stuff dissolved in it. That's about 55% of our blood. Okay. All right. So responsibilities. The number 1 responsibility for our red blood cell is to transport oxygen. It can move carbon dioxide, but carbon dioxide moves in a lot of different types of ways. Primarily, oxygen moves through our body through our red blood cells. Okay. Our white blood cells, or leukocytes, these guys are our fighter cells. These help fight infection. And then the platelets, otherwise known as thrombocytes, these guys are cell fragments that play a role in our blood clotting. So if we didn't have platelets, our blood would not clot, which is bad because even little minor cuts, we would continue to bleed out. Okay. All right, so the formed elements. So this is just a nice little image to see what we're looking at. So here's a white blood cell. So this is a really cool picture. This is a picture taken through a scanning electron microscope. So those of you who've taken microscopes in Science 10 can see this image. So scanning electron microscope actually gives us a really nice 3D image. So we see a 3D image of a red blood cell. And it kind of looks like a tire that has like been shrink wrapped, because we don't actually have a hole there, but we have a divot here, right? So that's what a red blood cell should look like. Here's a white blood cell. We have different varieties of them, but here's an example of one. So we see that it's a little bit bigger than a red blood cell. And here's our little platelets. So these are teeny tiny, but super, super important for us. Okay, so our formed elements are 45% of our whole blood. The rest of it, well, why don't I just ask you guys that? What's the other 55% of the blood? Awesome. So the other 55% of our blood is plasma. Okay, so 45% is the formed elements. So that's the bigger cell parts, white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets. The rest of it is our plasma. Okay, so formed elements are cells or cell fragments. And if we take a look at this image here, so this is just an illustration, but again, we're looking at the different formed elements. So let's look at the one here in this side. What is this pointing at? This, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but let's do this. What is this pointing at? Okay, what do we call those cells it's pointing at? Okay, so those are leukocytes. Thanks. That's okay, Mackenzie. If you have to go, you have to go. All right, so the first one we're starting off with is a leukocyte. Okay. All right, so leukocyte, remember, is a fancy word for white blood cell, but you have to know both terms, okay? All right, the next one we're looking at is these little doodads here. What are these called? Awesome, so what we're looking at next, these little pieces here are platelets. Okay, and then lastly, what am I looking at here? Okay, so here we see erythrocyte, which is a fancy word for red blood cell. Okay. All right. So erythrocytes, about 44% of our blood volume. Okay, so we see these little kind of disc-shaped cells along the bottom. They don't have a nucleus. So that's interesting for us. So red blood cells don't have a nucleus, which means they don't have any genetic information, which means they can't divide, and they don't. They're produced by our bone marrow, and every 120 days, they die. So once upon a time, probably over 100 years ago, there was a theory that if we would just take a young person's blood and put that into an old person's body, we could make them young again. But that obviously didn't work, and they didn't understand blood transfusions, which we'll get into in our next lesson. Our red blood cells are the same age. So even though I'm a lot older than you, my red blood cells are the same age as your red blood cells. Your red blood cells are the same age as your grandparents' red blood cells because they're regenerated about every 4 months or so. Okay. What I like about this little image that I found on the side is it just reminds us that our red blood cells carry oxygen, right? So they grab oxygen from our lungs, and then they're going to carry that oxygen till it gets to our body cells, where that will now diffuse into the body cell. Okay, so erythrocytes. So how do they do this? How do they carry oxygen? They do that through a protein that's called hemoglobin. Now, this hemoglobin, you see this word here, heme. And heme is a fancy word. It's blood, but it's telling us about iron being present, okay? So this hemoglobin molecule actually has iron embedded, or this hemoglobin protein has iron in it. So when we look at this image here, let me get the spotlight again. When we look at this image, all these little dots that we're looking at, okay, and all these little dots we're looking at here, so these little dots, these are referring to hemoglobin, which is the protein that attaches to oxygen. So red blood cells have hemoglobin, oxygen comes in and it attaches to the hemoglobin, And then when it's ready for that red blood cell to drop off the oxygen, it's released from the hemoglobin. Okay, so hemoglobin is an important part of our red blood cells. Okay, so it carries oxygen, or it contains oxygen. It binds to, sorry, let me go back. Hemoglobin is a protein that has iron, and those work together, and then it binds to oxygen. So I'm just going to go back for 1 second. Some people suffer from a condition called anemia. Now, what anemia means is that our body isn't getting enough oxygen to our cells. Okay, and if we don't get oxygen to our cells can't create ATP. They can't make energy. So we get really, really tired. So people who suffer from anemia get tired because their blood can't carry enough oxygen. There's a few reasons why that could happen. That could happen because we don't have red blood cells, right? Our count of red blood cells is too low. That could happen because we don't have enough hemoglobin on our red blood cells. It could be because we lack iron, because if we don't have iron, our body can't make hemoglobin. So those are the three things, and they all basically lead to the same condition. They lead to anemia because our blood doesn't have enough oxygen to give to our cells, so we're tired all the time. Okay? So those are typically what lead to anemia happening. All right. Now, I have a little clip here. We're not going to watch it because it wasn't very successful last time I tried that, but I would encourage you guys to watch this after we're done. It just talks a little bit about how hemoglobin hangs on to oxygen. So here's a little interesting fact for you. Just gonna, 1 second here, guys. Make sure I'm on track with time. A little fact with you, or for you, is that carbon monoxide, so that's that colorless, odorless gas that can kill us. Carbon monoxide actually binds to our red blood cells in the same spot that oxygen does. But it doesn't let go. Oxygen, the hemoglobin lets that go when it gets to cells. Carbon monoxide doesn't. It hangs on really, really tight. So if we are exposed to carbon monoxide, we can't get oxygen in our body, and then we die. Okay, and that's because carbon monoxide will actually bind to the same sites that oxygen will, except way stronger. Okay, all right. So now we'll look at leukocytes. So leukocytes, they're for fighting infection. Okay, and when we're sick, our amount of white blood cells actually goes up. It increases because our little fighter cells are starting to replicate to build this little army for us to help fight an infection. Now, part of what they do is make us feel sick. So when you have a runny nose or a cough or a fever, any of those things, that's actually our immune system fighting an infection. Okay, so that's what's going on, is they're actually doing their job. So when you have a fever, that means your body is actually doing its job. Okay. All right, so our leukocytes are part of our immune system. Now they do have a nucleus and they're colorless. So we call them white blood cells, but they're basically colorless. Okay. So their main job is to fight infection. They're bigger than red blood cells, but there's not as many of them. And we saw that in that first image when we were looking at the test tube, right? 44 to 45%, that bottom of the test tube is red blood cells. And then that teeny tiny little layer, that buffy coat in the middle, that was platelets and white blood cells mixed together. But when we get sick, they actually test for white blood cells to see if we have an increase in certain parts of our body. Okay, so 1 white blood cell for every 700 red blood cells. All right, and then platelets. Platelets, these are the cell parts. So I just put this little cartoon in here. Okay, so platelets, they all kind of stick together and they cause our blood clotting effect to happen. Okay, so there's cell fragments involved in blood clotting. They're just fragments, so they don't have a nucleus. Okay. So the steps for this: the skin is cut. And what happens is when our skin is cut, all the edges get rough, and the platelets that are running through the blood vessel, they get cut up from that cut edge of the blood vessel, okay? And they break, okay? They're little parts, but they break. And when they break, they release a bunch of chemicals. And as they release these chemicals, it causes this really long series of reactions that we don't have to know in this class, okay? But what it basically does is it leads to a protein net. So this protein that's got all this fiber on it get produced as a result, and it kind of coats over where that cut is in the blood vessel. And this net traps red blood cells in it. Okay, and what we get is a blood clot. And that's important because if we didn't have a clot at the site of where our cut was, then we'd end up just blood would continue to come out. Okay. So over here on the left, we can see an image with all of this like fibrous protein net, and it's catching those red blood cells. And then if I look on the right here, okay, so we can see what it should look like in our normal blood vessel. So there's no cut. And then over here, we see that a cut has happened. Okay, so we see this cut, and we see our little platelets, and the platelets are joining up here, and they're breaking. And we have chemicals that are released, causes this big reaction, and we get this protein called fibrin. So that's what makes all of this fibrous material. And that gets produced. And then all of the blood stops there, and eventually that blood makes a blood clot. So that's eventually going to make a little scab on you. And if you break that scab, you're actually opening that up again. That scab's actually protecting us from blood loss and protecting us from getting any infections. Okay. All right. Okay. So again, our last part that we need to look at is the plasma. So the plasma, we see that we've got, if we look at this image here, okay, so on the bottom part, here's our red blood cell part, the erythrocytes. Here's the buffy coat, so that's the white blood cells and the platelets. And then this straw-colored liquid is the plasma. So plasma is not clear, kind of looks like straw, it's sort of a yellowy color. Okay, so that's 55% of our blood volume. And that's the liquid part of our blood. All right, so what's in our plasma? Well, number one is water, right? So it's liquid, it's mostly water. So our formed elements, our red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets all have to float through it, okay? Then we have other things that are in it, okay? So we have proteins. And there's lots of different types of proteins that are in there. One of them are antibodies. So antibodies are part of our, they're not white blood cells, but they're little proteins that our white blood cells make that help us fight a specific target. Okay, so once we know what our enemy is, it makes these little specified targets, and these little proteins can attach onto them and kind of mark our target for destruction. Okay, enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that allow for reactions to happen in the body. Okay, and basically every process that happens in our body requires an enzyme. So I talked about blood clotting having like multitude of steps. Every one of those steps requires an enzyme in order to continue. Okay, so we have proteins in our blood plasma. We have gases, all right? Carbon dioxide and oxygen gases. Actually, I want to just, I'm not going to. Nutrients, glucose, amino acids, lipids, right? So those are the three primary nutrients. Our carbs, amino acids are the building blocks that make proteins for us. Our lipids are like our fats. So those are all dissolved in our plasma. Okay, we have electrolytes. So we talk about electrolytes. Basically, these are ions. So if you remember ions from Science 9 or Science 10, these are all dissolved in our blood. And usually we have like this regulated amount. So calcium, if we have too much, it's bad. If we have too little, it's bad. Sodium, if we have too much, it's bad. If we have too little, it's bad. So we need just the right amount. And there's different mechanisms to control that. Okay. Hormones. So hormones travel through our body for all sorts of things, like growth hormone that makes us grow, like insulin is a hormone that helps regulate how much sugar is in our blood, those types of things. Vitamins are really important to us, right? As our body breaks down food, it provides vitamins that allow for different reactions to happen in our body. Wastes, right? Big important part, waste of traveling through our blood plasma. Drugs, right? So when we take drugs, most of those drugs can be detected through our blood plasma. All right, so I have a couple videos here of blood components, so I would strongly recommend you guys watch those. So we have one video that I had a little bit earlier about hemoglobin, and then these two videos are on blood components. So I would encourage you to do that. And then I'm just going to share with you your homework. So I've already posted your homework as an assignment here, but here's what it looks like. Okay. So very similar to the first worksheet I gave you. So a lot of different blanks to fill in. Okay. And I just wanted to give you a note about the homework. Some of you typing in your answers and sending it to me that way as a new assignment is fine. Or if it's easier for you to do it by hand, like you don't have to rewrite questions, just question one. And then just write your answers down if that's easier for you, and then take a picture of it and send it to me, okay? Do whatever's easiest for you. You certainly don't have to type in your answers if that's difficult. Just do it by hand and take a picture, okay? So in summary, so you have this worksheet. The worksheet, I believe I said it was due on, I can't remember when I said it was due. I think I said it was due on Monday. Let me just double check here really quickly while you're all here. Well, 9 of you were here. Just 1 second. And okay, so I posted it on Classroom. I said Monday at noon. Okay, so the worksheet's due Monday at noon. I would recommend just getting it done today or tomorrow, and then you don't have to worry about it for the weekend. So if we think about what's coming up, if you're finished with the first aid, awesome. Okay, I've got your first aid quiz marked. It's already posted. I'm doing the booklets one by one, so the first one is done and posted already. You already know the deadlines for those. This worksheet is due next Monday. We won't have a lecture on Monday because it's a holiday, but we will on Wednesday. And then you can imagine you are having a quiz on blood vessels and blood shortly after that. Okay? All right. I see chat here. The first aid quiz is posted on PowerSchool, yes. Friday, so the blood vessel worksheet is due on Monday. I haven't totally decided when the quiz is going to be. Yeah, this week is Good Friday. Oh, sorry. Yes, we don't have a lecture on Friday because it's Good Friday. Yeah. So yeah, so the first aid quiz is posted. The quiz you just wrote on the heart is not posted. I haven't taken a look at the written response stuff for that yet. So I'll get to that probably the next day or two, and I'll have that posted for you. Okay. So yeah, no lecture on Friday. Any other questions? All right, so I do have my office hours from 10 to 12 every day. That's a school day. And don't feel free to email me whenever you need any hand with anything as well. Okay, and we will sign off for today.